From an early age, being reliable became less a trait and more a requirement. It was not praised in ways that made it feel chosen or cherished. It was simply expected, like gravity. Reliability meant showing up quietly, filling gaps before anyone else noticed they existed, and absorbing pressure without complaint. It meant learning very young that stability was more valuable than desire, that usefulness earned you a place even if affection did not. Over time, reliability hardened into an identity, one shaped by unspoken contracts and reinforced by silence. There was comfort in it at first, a sense of purpose in being needed, but that comfort carried a cost that accumulated slowly and invisibly. Being the reliable one often meant becoming emotionally fluent in crisis while remaining illiterate in your own needs. You learned to anticipate problems before they were voiced, to translate tension in a room into action, to fix things so efficiently that no one had to ask. This skill set was admired, but it was also exploited. Because reliability prevented collapse, it erased evidence of struggle. Sacrifice, when done consistently and without spectacle, begins to look like ease. People assume you are fine because you always have been. The more you give, the less anyone thinks to ask what it costs you to give it. Over time, reliability can quietly replace reciprocity. Relationships become unbalanced, not because others intend harm, but because they adapt to the version of you that never says no. Your support becomes infrastructure, something built into the background of their lives. When that happens, gratitude fades into entitlement. Help is no longer recognized as generosity, but as obligation. You are praised for being steady, dependable, strong, but never asked if you are tired. The language used to describe you becomes transactional. You are practical, low maintenance, the one who can handle it. Labels that sound respectful, but function as permission to overlook you. The true cost of being the reliable one is not just exhaustion, but invisibility. Your dreams are deferred in small, reasonable ways until they disappear entirely. Your wants feel indulgent compared to everyone else's emergencies. You begin to believe that asking for more would be selfish, that rest must be earned through overextension. Even love becomes conditional, tied to how much you can carry without breaking. And when you finally do falter, when you pause or push back, the reaction is often confusion or resentment rather than concern. Reliability, once withdrawn, feels like betrayal to those who depended on it without acknowledgement. There is also a private grief in realizing how much of yourself you gave away before anyone noticed your absence. The years spent being dependable cannot be reclaimed, only understood. Yet within that understanding lies the beginning of change. Recognizing the cost does not erase the past, but it reframes it. It reveals that reliability, while valuable, should never require self-erasure. The moment you see that your worth is not measured by endurance alone, the burden begins to lift. What remains is not bitterness, but clarity. Being reliable should be a choice, not a sentence, and no one should have to disappear to keep others standing. Silence has a way of being misunderstood, especially when it belongs to someone who has learned that peace is maintained by not asking for much. When silence is mistaken for obligation, it becomes a quiet contract no one ever signed, yet everyone expects to be honored. It begins subtly, in moments where speaking up feels unnecessary or inconvenient, where it seems easier to comply than to explain. Over time, that quiet compliance is misread as consent, and consent hardens into expectation. What was once generosity becomes assumed duty, and the person who stays silent is recast as someone who owes rather than offers. Silence often grows from empathy. It comes from understanding others' stress, from not wanting to add weight to already heavy situations. The silent person sees the tension in a room and chooses restraint, believing that holding back is kindness. But when that restraint is consistent, it sends a misleading message. Others interpret the absence of protest as comfort, the lack of refusal as willingness. Needs go unspoken, boundaries remain undefined, and the world fills in the gaps with its own assumptions. Slowly, the silent one is positioned as a permanent solution rather than a human being with limits. There is a particular loneliness in realizing that your silence has been doing all the talking for you. It has told people you are available, flexible, endlessly capable. It has told them you will adapt, absorb, adjust. And because you never correct that narrative, it solidifies. Requests stop sounding like requests. They arrive already wrapped in certainty, delivered with the expectation of compliance. When you hesitate, confusion follows. When you resist, disappointment turns sharp. Silence, once used to preserve harmony, becomes the very thing that traps you in it. Mistaking silence for obligation also erases choice. It strips actions of their meaning by pretending they were inevitable. Help given freely is reframed as something you were supposed to do anyway. Sacrifice becomes invisible because it was never announced. In this way, silence robs both sides. The giver is unseen, and the receiver never learns gratitude. What remains is a distorted dynamic where one person feels drained and the other feels wronged the moment the pattern breaks. Breaking that silence is rarely dramatic, but it is disruptive. The first no lands heavier than expected because it contradicts years of unspoken agreement. People question motives, search for hidden resentment, or accuse you of changing. In truth, you are simply becoming audible. You are replacing assumption with clarity. This shift can feel uncomfortable, even cruel to those who benefited from your quietness, but it is necessary for anything resembling balance to exist. Silence is not a promise. It is not a contract, nor is it an open-ended obligation. It is often just a pause, a moment of grace, or a choice made under pressure. When that distinction is ignored, silence becomes a burden rather than a boundary. Learning to speak does not erase compassion, it refines it. It ensures that what you give is chosen, not extracted, and that your presence is valued, not because it is guaranteed, but because it is genuine. The night the truth finally spoke did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came wrapped in calm, carried on a voice that had spent years learning how to stay quiet. It was the kind of night where everything looked the same on the surface. Familiar faces, practiced smiles, routines so well rehearsed they felt permanent. Yet beneath that normalcy, something had already shifted. The truth had been waiting, patient and heavy, gathering strength in the spaces where words had been swallowed for too long. For years, silence had been mistaken for peace. Truth had been postponed in the name of harmony, deferred to keep the balance intact. Each unspoken sentence added weight, each compromise layering over the last, until the ground beneath that balance began to crack. The truth did not emerge because it was rehearsed or planned. It spoke because it could no longer remain contained. When a boundary is crossed one time too many, restraint stops being a virtue and becomes self-erasure. That night marked the moment when endurance finally met its limit. When the truth surfaced, it did not sound cruel or vengeful. It sounded factual, steady, unavoidable. That is what made it unsettling. There were no embellishments, no accusations shouted across the room, just clarity delivered without apology. The words carried the force of everything they represented: years of overlooked effort, sacrifices reframed as obligations, love confused with utility. The reaction was not immediate outrage, but silence, the kind that follows realization. In that pause, power shifted. The truth rearranged the room without moving a single object. What makes such nights unforgettable is not the confrontation itself, but the internal transformation that accompanies it. Speaking the truth out loud redraws the shape of the self. It collapses the distance between who you has been and who you are becoming. In that moment, fear does not disappear, but it loses authority. The fear of being misunderstood, of being disliked, of being abandoned. All of it takes a back seat to something more urgent, self-respect. The truth speaks when protecting yourself becomes more important than being palatable. There is often fallout after the truth is spoken. Relationships strain under the weight of new reality. People who benefited from your silence struggle to reconcile the version of you they relied on with the one now standing in front of them. The truth disrupts comfort, especially when comfort was built on imbalance. Yet, even as consequences unfold, there is an undeniable sense of relief. The body recognizes honesty the way lungs recognize air. Something loosens. The constant vigilance required to maintain silence finally ends. The night the truth finally spoke did not fix everything. It did not rewrite the past or guarantee understanding. What it did was irreversible. Once spoken, the truth cannot be unheard, even if it is ignored. More importantly, it cannot be taken back within yourself. That night becomes a line drawn quietly but firmly, separating endurance from agency. After that, silence is no longer imposed, it is chosen, and the voice that once stayed hidden learns that it does not need permission to exist. Letting go of the role that erased me was not a single decision, but a slow unlearning of who I had been taught to be. The role had formed early, shaped by expectation and reinforced by praise that only arrived when I made myself smaller. I was valued for what I could provide, for how smoothly I could prevent discomfort, for how little space I seemed to need. Over time, that role became so familiar that I mistook it for my personality. I did not realize I was disappearing because the disappearance was gradual, quiet, and rewarded. The role demanded consistency without recognition. It required me to be adaptable, endlessly capable, and emotionally muted. I learned to read rooms better than I read my own feelings, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to solve problems without leaving fingerprints behind. Each success made the role harder to abandon. The more reliable I became, the less imaginable my absence seemed. In being everything to everyone else, I became almost nothing to myself. My desires felt inconvenient, my exhaustion unjustified, my dreams negotiable. What made the role especially difficult to release was the fear attached to it. I believed that without it, I would lose connection, belonging, and love. The role functioned like armor and leash at the same time. It protected me from conflict, but kept me tethered to obligation. I told myself I was being generous, but generosity that requires self-erasure is not generosity, it is survival. I stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, even though staying was costing me my sense of self. Letting go began the moment I recognized that the role did not define my worth. That realization was unsettling. Without the familiar script, I did not immediately know who I was or how to exist in relationships that were no longer structured around my usefulness. Silence followed, not the heavy silence of suppression, but an open one filled with uncertainty. People reacted differently to my absence from the role. Some were confused, some angry, some distant. Their responses revealed a truth I had avoided. Many connections had been maintained by what I provided, not by who I was. Grief was part of the release. I mourned the years spent contorting myself into something acceptable. I mourned the version of me that believed love had to be earned through sacrifice. But alongside that grief came relief. Without the role, my energy returned in small, surprising ways. I noticed my own preferences, my own pace, my own voice. I began making choices that were not strategic or self-protective, but honest. Letting go of the role that erased me did not make me harder or colder. It made me clearer. I learned that presence does not require performance, and that boundaries do not destroy connection, they define it. The role may have kept me needed, but it never allowed me to be known. Releasing it created space for something quieter and truer to exist. In that space, I did not vanish. I finally arrived. Freedom found in saying no does not arrive as defiance or anger. It arrives softly, often disguised as hesitation, a pause where compliance once lived. For those who have spent their lives accommodating others, saying no feels unnatural at first, almost cruel. It contradicts years of conditioning that equated worth with availability and love with sacrifice. Yet within that single word lies an unexpected release, a reclaiming of self that cannot be achieved through endurance alone. Saying no dismantles the illusion that responsibility for others' stability belongs to you. It exposes how often obligation was inherited rather than chosen, how frequently boundaries were crossed simply because they were never named. The first refusal carries weight because it interrupts a pattern. People notice. Some are surprised, others offended. Not because the refusal is unreasonable, but because they had grown accustomed to your compliance. Their reactions reveal a truth that is difficult to face. Access to you had been taken for granted. In that realization, the power dynamic shifts. Freedom emerges not from the conflict that follows, but from the internal alignment that saying no creates. The body recognizes it immediately. The tension held in the chest loosens. The constant mental calculation of how to manage others' expectations quiets. There is relief in choosing yourself without justification. Saying no clarifies where your responsibility ends and another person's begins. It restores agency to decisions that once felt automatic. Instead of reacting, you begin responding. Instead of absorbing, you begin discerning. There is also grief in this freedom. Saying no often results in distance, silence, or disappointment. Some relationships weaken when they are no longer fueled by your self-denial. This loss can feel personal, even when it is structural. You may question whether the freedom is worth the cost, but over time it becomes clear that what fades was not mutual care but dependency. What remains has space to be honest. Relationships that survive your no are built on respect rather than extraction. Freedom found in saying no is not about withholding kindness. It is about redefining it. Kindness without consent becomes depletion. Generosity without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. When you say no, you are not closing your heart, you are protecting it. You are ensuring that what you give is intentional, not coerced by guilt or fear. This discernment deepens compassion rather than diminishing it, because it allows you to show up fully when you do choose to say yes. Over time, no becomes less charged. It loses its sharp edges and settles into neutrality. It becomes a tool rather than a weapon, a boundary rather than a rejection. In that steadiness, freedom takes root. You begin to live from alignment instead of obligation, from clarity instead of habit. The life that unfolds is quieter, but it is yours. Freedom is not found in endless giving. It is found in the moment you realize you are allowed to stop.